So good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Nourish panel discussion from Kitchens to Cities, Stories of Richmond and Vancouver Chinatown Food Culture. My name is Kathy Tykolis. I am the Richmond Art Gallery's Education and Public Programs Coordinator, and I'm here to introduce our program today. First of all, I want to thank you all for zooming in on this beautiful day and supporting the Richmond Art Gallery's programs. And note, this is just one of a series of talks and events that we've been hosting throughout the Nourish exhibition that runs until April 3rd, 2022. All of this is thanks to the Richmond Has Heart program. So please visit our website and our social media platforms to see what else is happening for the duration of this exhibition, focused on themes of nourishment, as well as video recordings of some of the past events we've been hosting. I just would like to introduce our host and moderator, gallery curator Nan Capogna. Nan curated the Nourish exhibition, which features the artist duo Mizonk and poet and artist Jane Wong. So with the exhibition so focused on nourishment, we all thought it would be great to find out some history and the current realities of food culture, both in Richmond and in Chinatown. So that is how this panel has come about, and Nan will introduce each of our guest panelists that we're so happy to have here with us today. So I'll hand it over to Nan to lead the conversation. I'll disappear into the background to help monitor your questions. Meanwhile, thank you, Nan and panelists, for being here, and I'll let you jump into the discussion.
Thank you, Kathy. Hello, everyone. Really so thrilled to be here today with our three panelists. Before we begin, I would just like to give a little bit of background, a little bit of context with the exhibition, which is really the impetus of how we came to be here today. Nourishment, its scope and significance lies at the heart of the works of Jane Wong and artist duo Mizonk, husband and wife artist duo Wan Yi Lin and Roger Chen. How we are nourished, it can rouse memories of deep emotional intensity. Wong, a Seattle-based poet and artist, draws upon her experience of growing up in a Chinese American restaurant in New Jersey and her family's history of hunger and poverty in China. Taiwanese-born artists Lin and Chen live and work on 6 acres in Greater Vancouver, a practice in living that has provided sustenance and inspiration for the last 20 years. Wong and Mizonk present 2 installations, respectively. After preparing the altar, the ghosts feast feverishly, and 6 acres. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the 3 individuals who will bring deep knowledge and experience in food and culture. I will just go alphabetically. I'll start with Alexandra Gill. Alexandra has been the BC restaurant critic for the Globe and Mail newspaper since 2005. She is also the editor of Canada's Best Bars and a judge for many prestigious food competitions, including Iron Chef Canada, Canada's 100 Best Restaurants, and the Chinese Restaurant Awards. Dine Like a Critic is her new food tour company, which offers private culinary experiences, including the Richmond Chinese Dinner Party, from Classic Cantonese to New Wave. So for more information, please go to dinelikeacritic.com.
Thanks, Nan.
Bo Lee is the man behind The Fish Man, who used to run Lee's China Grill in Vancouver before selling the operation to new owners. Lee is a talented young chef creating stellar Szechuan style dishes. The Fish Man is located in Alexandra Road and specializes in Szechuan style Chinese seafood made with ocean-wise seafood where possible. In 2019, the stir-fry spicy clams won Critics' Choice Award at the Chinese Restaurant Awards. Dr.
Yet another
Henry,
award winner this year as well. Yeah, just
that's right. Dr. Henry Yu is a history professor. Dr. Yu's research and teaching has been built around collaborations with local community organizations, civic institutions such as museums, and multi-levels of government. He's passionate about helping Canadians unlearn the cultural and historical legacies of colonialism and to be inspired by the often hidden and untold stories of those who struggled against racism and made Canadian society more inclusive and just. He was the co-chair of the City of Vancouver's Dialogues Between Nations, Urban, Aboriginal, and Immigrant Communities, and he has served on advisory committees for formal apologies, acknowledging historical discrimination, and for the implementation of substantive legacy projects at all 3 levels of government. Dr. Yu received his BA in Honors History from UBC and MA and PhD in History from Princeton University. He was awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012 and the Province of BC's Multicultural Award in 2015 in recognition of his research and community leadership. So what I would like to do is to begin by asking each panelist to just further introduce themselves, because that introduction was very brief, and to share their connection and their interest to food culture. So what I would like to do is start with Alexandra, please.
Hi. Well, I came to Vancouver in 2001 as the Western Arts correspondent for the Globe and Mail. I came from Toronto, which is my hometown. My mandate here was to not just write about arts and entertainment, but to also write about lifestyle. It was a pretty big bureau, but everybody was a serious news hound, and nobody was really, nobody in the Toronto head office sort of had any idea of what was going on the ground in Vancouver. So they asked me to write about food or fashion or design or fitness or travel, all the fun stuff. And I immediately fell in love with the food culture in Vancouver. This was 2001, and I thought it was very advanced, ahead of the curve compared to Toronto. Restaurants were concerned in serving sustainable seafood, taking a lot of farm salmon off the menu and things like that. There was a vibrant farmers market community, and people were talking about heirloom tomatoes and things that I'd never heard before. People were very supportive of BC wine. It was just people were talking about GMOs. It was just a very engaged food culture. And so I immediately started writing a lot about food features, really. When I started writing restaurant reviews a few years later, I had long realized that part of this vibrant food culture was a huge Chinese community, and it was an essential part of the restaurant culture here and the broader foodway systems. And I knew I had to start writing about that if I was going to be a legitimate restaurant critic. And so what I did was, at the time, I knew very little except for, my experience with Chinese food was basically takeout egg rolls, and late night chop suey, very Canadian Chinese cuisine. And I was very intimidated about going into Richmond to explore the restaurants, because social media wasn't what it is today. And this was, it was set, there were so many restaurants and I didn't quite know where to start. So I reached out to some people in the community, Chinese diners, and people were very interested in Chinese food. I found them through online communities, and it turned out these were, a couple of people, Brendan Matthews and Lee Mann, who later became the founding judges of the Chinese Restaurant Awards. I just reached out to them and I said, hey, can you take me to some restaurants and show me a bit? So they took me by the hand and took me to a lot of great restaurants, and very slowly over many, many years, taught me a lot about Chinese restaurants. And eventually I became proficient enough, or, knowledgeable enough to start writing a few on my own and joining the Chinese Restaurant Awards, where, my understanding, was just like, it was a meteoric rise then when we started going out together a lot. But what interests me about, this panel especially, is that when I'm writing restaurant reviews, it's not just, is this food good or is this food bad? Is it done properly? I mean, the idea of a restaurant review, criticism in general, is to put it in context, to understand, how is this particular restaurant or this chef, what are they adding to the food culture? What is the context? How does this compare to the national scene, to the international scene? How are patterns changing over times, and where are the trends? And there's just so much more to criticism than this is lovely food. So I look forward to having you to this discussion and talking more about the context of food in our cities.
That's great, Alexandra. Thank you so much. And Bo, if we could, if you can give us a little bit more background on you and what's your connection to the food culture?
Yeah, my name is Bo Lee. I came to Canada 2002 as an international student. And I arrived in Winnipeg first, but my parents expect me to study business. But I grew up and raised in the restaurant business setting before I was born, and they was already operating a small restaurant in China, my parents. So I think this has some heritage and the DNA in me already. So I actually dropped out from the university and starting my small business step by steps. So I was first training as a Japanese chef in Winnipeg, and in 2009 I started my sushi restaurant in Winnipeg, and then 2012 I started a northern style of Chinese restaurant cuisine in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So that time is we still don't have that much mainland kind of Chinese restaurant in Vancouver. So it started to become trendy and trendier. And 6 years after that, I moved to Richmond and opened the current establishment as the Fishman. So this restaurant is particularly using the local ingredient, but finished in the Chinese cuisine ways. So the restaurant is a little bit different setting than the normal restaurant. We go to the Cantonese restaurant, dim sum. It's something new, something different. And in the recent year, I find the food is popular and there's more diversity of my clientele who can accept this kind of food compared to a few years before. So this is getting really interesting for me for the restaurant. And as I step further in this career and in this restaurant business, I really find that training people and training young chefs is another main thing for me to finish, other than just operating the restaurant and cooking the food.
Thank you. And Henry.
Thanks, Nan. I'm really happy to be here. And so thanks for the invitation from Richmond Art Gallery to join this conversation. I think first and foremost, I love to eat food. I don't know, and that's why I love to be here. And I love Richmond because of the great variety of restaurants, 400 plus, different kinds of restaurants. And so as an individual and someone who lives in the Lower Mainland, I love going out and eating food. So that's part of food cuisine, food culture. But for me also as a historian, as a researcher, to me, it's also, I'm interested in restaurants because what food can tell us about who we are and where we are. And, so for instance, I just want to quickly acknowledge that I'm joining you by Zoom from UBC campus, which is on the unceded ancestral traditional territory of Musqueam. And that a lot of the history for me of Chinese in Canada is about this kind of small town cafes. So from family cafes, you could say, to this idea of cuisine, that in fact restaurants began, and Chinese Canadian cafes in small towns across every small town in Canada, every small interior town in BC, they began really as kind of outcomes of migration, people moving around the world. And you can find Chinese restaurants all around the world, and different kinds of cuisines created out of that kind of mixing of migrants and people who are customers, including Indigenous communities all across this country. So that's, to me, I'm fascinated by the current moment, but I'm also fascinated by that history around the world of how restaurants came to be, of how restaurant cuisine and this idea that, you know, when you go out, let's go eat Thai. You know, you're not eating Thai people. You know, that would be really creepy and weird. You're eating Thai cuisine and you're engaging with Thai culture somehow. And you can say that across the board, that we live in a world now where food culture is not just consuming food and, as Alexandra said, trying to figure out whether you like it or not and whether it's good or not, but also engaging in cultural, really mixing and adaptation of foods that are brought by migrants to new places. So that's why I'm really, you know, listening to Bo and his talking about growing up in a restaurant and then coming to Canada. Richmond is this gateway, and, you know, I'm happy to talk about the history of trying to understand how Richmond now is the best place to eat Chinese food, whatever that means, of all the different kinds of cuisine from around, you know, the world actually that are labeled Chinese food. But there's a longer history too, where, you know, small town cafes and many of maybe our listeners who have grown up in other places, in small towns in Saskatchewan or the Maritimes or in small town Ontario, you know, I bet that you've experienced a Chinese restaurant or a Chinese cafe while you grew up. So it's a kind of fabric of our lives. And so that's why I think this kind of discussion today about restaurants and Chinese food and nourishment and the ways in which restaurants sometimes serve as community centers too, where people gather for birthdays, can celebrate occasions, to really mark their lives, the wonderful moments and also after funerals, you know, going out and going to a restaurant together. So even unhappy grieving moments. So they make meaning in our lives.
You're really bringing up this idea of relationships. You know, there's the relationships, you know, with the restaurants come in and they kind of cater to the clientele. But then the clientele then in return, you know, has an impact on the restaurant and food culture. And I find that really very interesting, you know, because it's organic and it develops. Something I would like to ask each of you is how Richmond has grown and changed, which has been tremendous in the last 20, 30 years. And I'd like to know what you think of Richmond food culture, you know, how it's changed and developed and what you've experienced and noted.
Maybe I can start because I feel like I may be the oldest. I'm going to throw myself out there and say that I remember a time, let's put it that way, when no one would have driven to Richmond to go get food, that there was no reputation of Richmond being a place that you would go and get great food. I mean, unless you think of McDonald's as the height of Scottish cuisine, there was a great McDonald's in Richmond. That's actually been recent phenomenon since the 1990s, really late 1980s. I remember when Aberdeen Mall, you know, had this amazing, you know, Hong Kong style dim sum restaurant. It was one of the first, actually, it's worth driving to. It's worth crossing one of those bridges, the Knight Street or the Oak Street Bridge, to go over there from the other side. Because again, the long history of Chinese restaurants has been either small town cafes where they were Chinese cafes not because of the food they served, but because of the people who ran it. They were Chinese. They would serve hamburgers, fries, things like that. And they might have something like chop suey or sweet and sour pork on their menu that was Chinese, but the rest of the stuff was, you know, what the customers wanted, as you said, Nan. And so really the rise of the idea of a Chinese restaurant in the early 20th century, that was dominated by Chinatown restaurants, by the idea that there was something called Chinese cuisine. And it was generally this kind of Cantonese style food that was adapted, you know, with things like electric red and orange colored sweet and sour sauce that made it appealing, deep frying things, the kind of adaptation of Chinese cuisine, you could say, around the world to adapt to local tastes. So Chinese restaurants in India it's adapted to Indian tastes. Chinese restaurants in Vietnam, you know, pho places, the noodle places, ramen places in Japan, you know, they're adapted to local taste. And I think that idea of adaptation what Richmond did was, as it became the gateway for a lot of Hong Kong Chinese to come to Canada and Vancouver, that region, and Richmond became the kind of gateway, twice daily, 3 times daily flights on Cathay Pacific between YVR and Hong Kong, that it became a place where Hong Kong Chinese cuisine became, that dim sum restaurant, Hong Kong style dim sum, for a place like Aberdeen Mall and Top Gun restaurant is that particular restaurant that people still remember. That began to change the food culture of Richmond, but also of Vancouver overall. As I said, Vancouver is not known as a great city for cuisine, and that you could perhaps blame the British. They're not exactly famous for their cuisine either. But Vancouver, I think, became and has become and is now one of the best places to actually eat, for instance, Cantonese style seafood outside of, well, anywhere, in fact, because of our fresh seafood. So to me, that's a huge change in just my lifetime. As I said, Richmond, when I was a kid, was famous for its advanced left turn lanes and being very flat, and an IKEA. And it was not famous for food. Now it is famous for food.
When I began writing about restaurants, I think Richmond was going through a bit of transition. It was still known sort of as the best Chinese food in North America, having best Chinese food in North America. But a lot of that was attributed to the big Cantonese Hong Kong Cantonese style restaurants that had opened up, the big banquet restaurants. Yeah. Which also, really adapted to, Canton and Hong Kong is famous for its seafood dishes, but the local seafood was embraced by the community here. And, I've heard that if you go to Hong Kong now, there's such a thing as a Vancouver style hot pot. I haven't had it there, but it's, a Vancouver hot pot using, local fish, probably all the same fish that Bo uses. But when I started reviewing restaurants, some of those there were a lot of Cantonese restaurants, but they weren't all Hong Kong. This was sort of the rise of the mainland Cantonese restaurant. It was the early aughts when which began the next wave from mainland China. And in those early days, there was a lot of money coming in too, with the new immigrants coming under the investment program. So you saw some of these big Cantonese restaurants or Hong Kong restaurants really trying to appeal to mainland tastes. There was more variety in the food, more spiciness from the northern regions, more exotic, very luxurious dishes that cost a lot of money. And instead of sort of in a Hong Kong style of dining, you'd have maybe one of those, sort of pricey abalone dishes, or or big Dungeness crab feast. But instead, people started ordering lots of them, as a show of of their wealth and their affluence and sort of the nouveau riche. And that's what I began seeing a lot in restaurants, or it was pointed out to me. And now, the mainland Chinese restaurant is so diverse. I think we still have great Chinese restaurants. We're still known as, one of the best in North America. But that reputation, which used to be attached to the great Cantonese Hong Kong style banquet restaurants, I think now, one of our calling cards is the diversity of cuisine that we have. And Bo is a great example of that, those restaurants.
Totally agree. I cannot go that further as Henry did. I'm not as old as he is. Anyways, but I remember when I just came to Vancouver about 15 years ago, and to compare to last 10 or 5 years, I already see the dramatically change. 15 years ago is really domained by Cantonese kind of cuisine, right? Yeah. The setting of the restaurant, right? The scale of the restaurant, and it's usually for a wedding party kind of thing, and dim sum kind of setting. So I started seeing change on that already, especially nowadays the social media really influence how the restaurateur is how they setting their restaurant, right? So they are more doing like a little bit fine dining, a little bit better eating environment and a better service, and trying to look in the same step as a Caucasian kind of setting for the restaurant. And also, I think the taste has really became diversity.
Yeah.
Part of that is the immigration wave has been changed, right?
Yeah.
From before the Hong Kong coming back, 1997, there's a lot of Hong Kongese people, so that's why the chef is coming together with them. So the food majority, it is kind of Cantonese food. And after 2000, you start to see a big wave of mainland Chinese they come in. So, I mean, they didn't come that much of chef at the time. As example, right? I came as an international student. Some of them, they come as a skilled worker, but they couldn't find a proper position in the society. And eventually they end up in the kitchen world. Yeah. But some of them, I think they eventually find the passion in them. So they start to run a restaurant business or being a chef. So I think that's where it started about 20 years ago for the mainland Chinese cook to nowadays. So I think that part is changing how the taste of Chinese cuisine in Richmond nowadays, right? Compared to before, mostly it's like for Caucasian kind of taste, sweet sour pork, the kind of dim sum or Cantonese style. Now it's go a little bit more spicy, a little bit more saltier, and also the way that social media influence, I think, is very big. People waiting to try different kind of style of food, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're good, right? So that gives the restaurant a hard time. Sometimes the turn ratio is very fast, and they think this may work. So as this example is working in somewhere in China or in some other cities, and they want to try out the idea. It may be popular for 3 months, and that's it. So I think what the restaurant surviving mode in Richmond or getting popular, you have to really know your market and your people who is eating your food and where their background, their culture, all that stuff. You have to, as a restaurant owner, you have to think about that, and you have to doing that on your food, a way to present them, to feed them comfortably. Yeah.
I always thought that compared to Western restaurants in Vancouver, the Chinese restaurants, I used to call them Yelp proof, because you couldn't, it didn't matter if they were getting great, and I think it's probably changing a bit now, but it doesn't really matter what kind of reviews they were getting on social media. If it wasn't good, like if it wasn't good, people wouldn't go and the chefs wouldn't last. The diners themselves are more critical than the critics, so to say, that and word of mouth spreads very quickly within the Chinese community. And that if a restaurant is, having a fallow period, they learn very quickly because people just don't come.
I can't overemphasize actually the importance of those points that I think Bo and Alexandra are making, that there's been a huge shift. I mean, when I was younger in the 80s and 90s, families sort of knew where to go. It was a word of mouth, and there was a loyalty. And when a chef moved from one restaurant to another, it wasn't advertised anywhere. It's just people knew, oh, by the way, so-and-so's moved over and the food's gone down. And then you would start to go that kind of non-social media world where the reputations of the food, that kind of dynamic between consumer and producer, let's say the people who are making the food and the people who are consuming it, that was a particular way in which a lot of restaurants lasted a long time based on those kinds of reputations and just the word of mouth of customers and who knew where to go. I think social media has really changed that, and as Bo mentioned and as Alexandra mentioned, it's created a kind of rapid turnover, that relationship often is sometimes the visuality of the food, the food pornography of people snapping pictures and putting them up, and it's like, doesn't even matter what it tastes like, because it's really more about how it looks on your camera. Like the phone eats before you do. This idea, you take the photo and that matters as much as or more than what it tastes like. And I think that's one of the interesting things about that diversity also that Bo mentioned over the last 15, 20 years, and that has risen. Everybody's a critic in some sense. Everybody's got, they're going to say what they thought.
Yeah, with experience or not. Yeah,
exactly. It doesn't matter. Exactly. Everybody's got their own little platform, and I'm not sure that it's created great food, but the countervailing force is that there's a lot more discerning consumers who know from growing up, that this reminds me of home, or this is the kind of food that tastes good. Is a different kind of Chinese food. You didn't have that. The great Chinese restaurants, you could say, before they innovated things in the 1990s. King crab, taking again local, regional Atlantic lobster. Again, Nova Scotian lobster, and there's a whole decades of Chinese cuisine built around that. These kind of fresh ingredients, salmon, but now I think there's a lot more of like the family or the individual, someone like Bo, bringing a particular, taste, as well as a desire to present something that maybe isn't in the market, but there is now a customer base, because there may be people who are also familiar with Northern Chinese cuisine or Sichuanese cuisine that actually can say, yeah, this is really done well. This is the way it's supposed to be done. And I think that kind of discerning landscape is what Alexandra's talking about as well, that, you can find that now in a way that you couldn't 30 years ago.
What I also see more broadly is a lot of Canadian-born Chinese chefs embracing their heritage, working perhaps in Western restaurants, but only very recently, I'd say in the last 5 years, maybe 5 to 10 years, you see, these some of these chefs have established themselves in Chinese restaurants or Japanese, like Bo, and and now saying, I feel confident enough to make my own sort of like dry aged quail, which Roger Ma does at Boulevard Restaurant in the Sun Place Hotel, and it's very much like a Cantonese barbecue squab, but he's doing it in his own way. And we always had a very strong Japanese influence in our Western cuisine, but we're beginning to see more and more of it now. Chinese influence in Western cuisine as well, and that's
I totally agree on that. I think as China opens them up to the world, right? So I think the food is the top things that influence Chinese culture, right? Before we are not express ourselves very good as Japanese, so that's why the sushi is so popular in the Canadian market, right? Chinese is most time they're shy, and they want hiding them behind, and they don't want to express them too much. For me now, I even have a desire that just go back to working together with my father for a few months, just get that kind of heritage and that kind of learning skills, and just working together and have a chance that represent the Chinese food to more on a broad platform, rather than just serving Chinese society, right?
It's interesting. I think what going to maybe to the theme of the panel, and when you're thinking about food as itself a form of art, a kind of making, that there is this what seems like a tension between authenticity and adaptability. So, for instance, my wife is Japanese, and she's saying 95% of the restaurants that are Japanese restaurants are not run by Japanese. They're either ethnic Chinese or Korean. And so does that mean that they're bad? Well, there's actually been this adaptation. In Japan, people don't eat sushi morning, lunch, and evening. They do in Vancouver. And so there's this kind of idea that you should always be eating sushi, always, she always jokes it in a dark way that we're the ones driving tuna to extinction, not Japanese. They go on special occasions to have sushi. But the idea that the adaptation of different cuisines, and you could say that for 500 years, it was part of the migration of people from southern China, Cantonese and others, out into the world that created, ramen, noodle places, pho places, the kind of Chinese restaurant that's around globally, everywhere around the world. And then the rise, you could say, of China's economy in the last 30 years has created a kind of taste within China to consume. And that's why Japanese restaurants in China, all kinds of sophisticated dining in China as China's economy has gotten stronger. And that's now kind of going out into the world as well. And so the kind of hybrid adaptive forms are creating new kinds of authenticity, new kinds of food that are really rooted in the kind of blending of, so Japanese trained Chinese chefs. I think of Taiwan at Lin Cafe, someone who was trained in French restaurants and then created Lin Cafe because he wanted to actually pay homage to his own roots as Vietnamese refugee who came in the 1980s. And that's happening all the time in a place like Vancouver, where people with very complicated, complex migration histories have, taken those bits of their own lives and past, just as Bo has, and then turned it into food in the way that any art form, is a product of the artist. You could say that these cuisines the authenticity of them are not dependent on some idea that this is the proper way to do Sichuanese food. Then someone comes from Sichuan and says, well, actually we do it all kinds of different ways. But it's to bring that authenticity of the person who's the maker, the making of it, the chef. And that's a huge shift away from family restaurants as economic, making money, and whatever the customer wants, you just give it to them. Versus this is a place that's an expression of the chef, of the person making the food, and I think that's improved our food immensely.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Henry bring out. That often people they ask me what kind of cuisine you're doing. I just told them it's a journey of my own, right? So it's built on the past experience, right? Built on the rule that I was born in the Chinese restaurant family kind of setting, and what kind of cuisine I did. I went to culinary art school for French cuisine. So it's all different part of influence, I think.
I sometimes take my tourists to Bo's restaurants because I said, oh, look, we can try all foreigners of China in one meal, because he really explores a lot of different regional cuisines. Yeah, it's not just a Sichuan restaurant. Yeah.
And I think that idea of why Richmond versus, again, I want to be careful to not be criticizing restaurants that are outside Richmond. There's wonderful restaurants all around the Lower Mainland, but I think something's going on in Richmond itself, which is to do with volume, but it also has to do with who's running them and the customer base that they have. That you can rise very quickly, through social media, and perhaps you make your food look good, but also just that reputational of something that really is the product of a person's life, of their own explorations, like with Bo and many others, that can become unique in a global way. There are few places that can story tell, food that way. We associate it with places like New York, we associate it with Los Angeles, where you have people coming from all around the world, highly talented people who and they weren't chefs at first, but they discovered that they were really good at it and had a passion and a love, and then they, through their lives and their careers unfolding, the Anthony Bourdains of the world, who are on these voyages of discovery, who also are making food. I don't think Vancouver was one of those kinds of places until really recently. I think again of 50 years ago when Italian food began to take off here, and it's because of a few people making it in a really decent way, and yet perhaps it took a while for the customer base to catch up, literally with them. Now it's a place where both in terms of makers and consumers, there is a sophistication that can recognize just how talented some of our chefs are. So that's, again, to celebrate that in Richmond as a food culture and a culinary environment that's has its fluorescence because of where we are in history, really, as a place that was really changed over the last 30, 40 years.
I think in Richmond also, the population, the size of the population, Asian population generally, and Chinese especially, and the concentration of restaurants creates a lot of competition.
Yeah.
So the restaurants, if you're not up to par, we'll just go to the restaurant around the corner. But also, I mean, Chinatown, I mean, Chinese food in Vancouver, grew up in Chinatown where, you know, obviously initially to, you know, for the Chinese community themselves, but then later in, I mean, the 1950s, it became a sort of an exotic destination for non-Chinese diners, and often, you know, had to appeal to the Western tastes. But in Richmond, it became a city of their own, where they could be proud of their culture. They didn't really have to adapt. It could be, they could create the restaurants they wanted. You know, that was, and that everybody wanted to. They didn't have to, you know, appease necessarily a broader clientele.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really interesting that just as the COVID rules has been, the restriction has been lifted out a little bit, and you see the traveler from all over North America, they come down to Richmond specifically for Chinese food.
Yeah,
and they know this place is one of the best place in North America. It's not because they want to cook it for Caucasian people in their own way, because they still keep doing more authentic way. So that's why the reason they come down to Richmond. I think we are located in a very particular location.
yeah,
The worldwide even. I have a customer from mainland China, from Hong Kong, and they come specifically for Vancouver, Richmond, for this one or two kind of seafood, for king crab, for gooey duck, right? Because those are broadly harvested in our coast, right? So I think we have that kind of advantage, and just being really fresh and being produced in Canada. So I think that's very interesting. You have people from mainland China, from Hong Kong, and they come down here. You have people from North America, from different city, either the Caucasian, either the Chinese, and they come down to Richmond for Chinese food. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and that kind of happy circumstance, you get the food you deserve, is the kind of, you should be on a t-shirt, because in some sense, you know, we have lots of customers who are from different backgrounds, and they have a fairly sophisticated palate of and then we have the fresh seafood, and I think I can't overemphasize how important that is, because freshness of the ingredients again is so key for across the board for not just Cantonese seafood, you know, restaurants, but you know, all around, you could say, in any kind of good cuisine, that kind of fresh ingredient. But I think that migration history that Bo also is referring to, that we've now have large numbers of people in Richmond who are, you know, and we look at the percentages, you know, Richmond is over 50%, you know, Asian of some kind of heritage, and not just Chinese, ethnic Chinese, but also, you know, other South Asians, across the board, that kind of diversity of tastes, diversity of the consuming taste. I'll give you an example. Back, you know, I look at old menus because as an historian, you know, there's many texts that we use and many sources. And you look at old restaurant menus. Now, there's this Chinatown restaurant in the 1940s I won't name, but you know, we're talking about a place where mayors were eating. There's banquets, and you know, one of their dishes was like it was a mix of barbecued duck in mayonnaise and canned fruit. You know? And you think about it, it's like, wow, that's a high banquet fare. You know, and I'll leave it at that. Is you can play out what that means about the taste of the customers, and who's, you know, I'm sure it was sweet, and I'm sure it was like creamy, and but was it good in some way? Does it matter? Because in the end, you know, that's what was on the menu. And now, are you going to impugn the chef and say that chef didn't know what he's doing, or he was giving customers what they wanted, and so you get the restaurant you deserve in that sense. So if people wanted to order that and they loved it, you know, they love canned fruit and mayonnaise and barbecue duck. Barbecue duck takes skill to make, you know. Yeah. And in southern China, where that person who made it, they would have been actually barbecuing geese. You know, there's no, but here they can't find decent geese that tasted as good as the ones there. So barbecue duck is famous in North America. but in the villages of Guangdong, where this stuff came from, it's barbecued geese. So I raise all these as ways of thinking, and for those fascinated, I'll drop in the chat. There's 2 books that I would recommend that are so wonderful. Anne Hui's Chop Suey Nation, which she made a journey across Canada to eat at these small town Chinese restaurants, and the other is Chuck Kwan's recent book, Have You Eaten Yet? Which is drawn actually from his series, a 15-part series that he did over 20 years ago now, going around to Chinese restaurants all around the world. And so if you're fascinated by some of the stuff we've been talking about, of sort of that confluence of migrants and the cuisine they make and the customers they're making it for, and how it leads to just fascinating new combinations and adaptations, I'd recommend those 2 books for everyone.
What I loved about Anne's book, and it's a broader conversation generally, is that, she tried to, she argued that some of those early, westernized Chinese food are still legitimate and authentic, and that's what people grew up with. And just last night, I was in Chinatown and I picked up some curry beef brisket. Yeah. And, I picked it up at Daisy Garden, but I've had it at it was sort of brought back by Chinatown Barbecue. Yeah. And we gave it an award for the Chinese Restaurant Awards. But a lot of Hong Kong diners went and they said, this isn't any good. This is terrible, because it's very different than the barbecue beef brisket that you get in Hong Kong. Yeah. But, it is a delicious, legitimate dish. Yeah. And it's, one that evolved here, and you won't find it anywhere else. And I brought it home last night, and my husband, who's French and very snobby about his food, said, this is a really good dish. Taste the, and so it's a great dish. It's it's sort of a Vancouver dish, but it's also a Chinese dish.
Yeah. And that's a great, and then Daisy Garden is a great town. It just reopened. It burned down over 5 years ago, and I just love the idea that that's the kind of level of taste that we can have, is that a place that can be reborn. And I really give a lot of credit to Suzanne Ng of Newtown, who opened it up again, and look, it's cleaner, nicer, and everything like that. But the food, as Alexandra said, it's like to make sure that the people who used to eat there, who went to Daisy Garden specifically for the beef brisket, curry and beef brisket, would recognize it. And that idea that it's authentic to that
place and time,
to that place and time, and the customers, the memories. And it's not just nostalgia. We all have nostalgia. I remember, again, for me, when I'm sick, I eat congee or because that's what my mom gave me when I was sick. And so when I'm sick, that's my comfort food. And we all have our comfort foods, those things that we consume that have deep meaning. And I think when you get to the level, and if you live in a city where the restaurants bring that kind of level of deep meaning, and I can think right now, my kids eating in maybe a Richmond restaurant, and I'm going, okay, that's weird, but that will become something deeply meaningful to them, or already is, and I think that's the way that food is at the center of our lives. When Denise Fong and I and Vivian Gosselin, we created a seat at the table, and it was supposed to be a pair of exhibits about Chinese Canadian history, or Chinese history in BC, but it had to be about food too. And so a seat at the table was always saying, we can't tell this story without telling a story of restaurants and cafes and the meaning of food in people's lives, or else it's a story bereft of meaning, of emotion, of affect, and that kind of visceral way that when you sit down and eat together, it is like sharing yourself. It's not a cuisine and culture in some abstract way.
It's especially important for immigrant, right? They don't have a strong tie with the society, right? So they have a place they can gather together and they can feel comfortable about the food is very important for them.
Yeah, I can't overemphasize that.
And I'm going to just interject here because I'm watching the time. And I wanted to just say, ask a couple of different things here, because you're talking about what has happened, where we are now. And Bo, you mentioned mentoring you know, chefs. And so we're looking into the future, you know, where is this going? What are some of the trends? And so I would like to ask, do you see some current trends that are coming up? What style of food is popular in Richmond?
Well, I think it's really come down to really, as Henry said, it's come down to a chef's personal, you know, kind of what they want to do. And in the nowadays society, it's really allowed us to do it that way. People is more open to trying different kind of food, and having kind of Chinese influence in that kind of restaurant. But I think as restaurant develop, nowadays the most important problem is that we don't have enough chef want to work in this kind of career.
Yeah.
So as a restaurant owner, or as you know, who want leading this kind of business, and I think we have to create a relevant, comfortable, well-paid job position for the chef and give them enough opportunity to developing their skills, right? Rather than before, you know, the Chinese master is very strict on their apprenticeship, right? So nowadays, the young people, they wouldn't last over a year and they already give up. So I think it would have to find out a new way to getting people more involved and finding their own passion and finding them they can do this, right? So I think that's I think you know, like what kind of cuisine, no matter we're doing that, each body they're gonna find their own client, but it's the thing that to making the young people get involved is the harder part.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
If you go into some of these into kitchens of some of the large Chinese banquet restaurants, you'll notice very quickly that it's an older, you know, kitchen. I mean, most kitchens, you know, the average age is under 40, and in Chinese restaurants, especially in the Cantonese restaurants, it's well over 40, because a lot of those chefs came, you know, with that first Hong Kong wave. When I think Henry mentioned this before, that they were actually given more points, but that doesn't exist anymore. And there's such a clampdown on foreign worker visas that we're having, you know, if there's an acute labor shortage in all restaurants, but it's even more pronounced in Chinese restaurants.
Yeah, and maybe I'll pick up on that what, you know, the future and the moment right now is, look, great restaurants, it's young chefs that are going to create those great restaurants of tomorrow, and they have to have a way of developing and learning. And you know, back in the 80s and 90s, under the point system, actually a top chef at a top hotel chef, say in Hong Kong, and then eventually other places too, you know, they were professionals. They were going to get the same kind of points in the point system that we have as a professional accountant, as a professional, any kind of white collar professional, you know, like a chef is a white collar professional in that way. And so we were able to attract many of the really top chefs from Hong Kong. It really remade our, you could say, the culinary world that we live in. But I think with the kind of control of temporary foreign workers, and now what's happening is you know, if you wanted to bring some top person, it's really tough now for restaurant owners, for those who own and run the restaurants. So in some sense, that kind of thinking about this as an industry, you know, young chefs, how can we help them develop and find their voice, you know, to use that metaphor, because their voice is going to be in the food they create. But if you bankrupt them because it's so exorbitantly expensive to start your own restaurant, and if you're dead within 6 months, 18 months, and you're in massive debt because just of the startup costs for opening a place, like how can we have these ways of pipelining young talent, you know, more of that kind of the street food and street markets and stuff. Again, if you're in Asia, you can hone and find your way in night markets and street food and things like that, or apprenticing, but not having this kind of really an apprenticeship system that is restrictive and doesn't allow you to actually experiment. And so there are lots of ways in which if you're asking, you know, how to redesign the way in which our hospitality and restaurant industry can actually be more nurturing of young talent, there are actual very concrete ways we can do it. And a place like Richmond, you know, we should. there's so much talent, there's so much potential, there's so much customer base that is sophisticated enough to be able to tell, yeah, this is good, or this is a young talent, we should support them. I think for me, that's something you can do in Richmond that perhaps there's no other place in Canada that you could actually accomplish that.
I agree.
And yet sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I agree. I think the future mode of running restaurant business is that you have to let your chef participate, and they have to get a big cut, big share of your profit.
Yeah.
You don't have necessary to invest the money, right?
Yeah.
If they're running the business, they have to get a bigger shares and to get them started in a way. Rather than like myself, I invest a lot of money for my own restaurant and I work for my own. I think the future way is more like you have a very good chef and his talent, he knows what he's doing, he have the respect and get the investor for him. I think more gonna be that way rather than, let's say you invest over $1 million for your restaurant, but you are not necessarily a very good business person to running you're a good chef. That doesn't mean you're a good business person, right? So
it goes across the board. Yeah. There's a problem with training though. How do we get good chefs if there's not a training program? I mean, the culinary schools give very short shrift to wok skills and a lot of the essential foundation work. I think Pika on Granville Island is trying to include more Chinese skills in their basic training program, but there's a real shortage of that. And in order to get to the apprenticeship level, you've got to have a bit of some of the basics.
Yeah, and in fact, the way that a lot of times people were used to do that who were young, and then they would go to Japan, learn, and come back, or they go to other places, they go to Hong Kong, they go and then bring the skills back. And I think that says something exactly as Alexandra said about, in fact, the lack of those kinds of training spaces, learning spaces, apprenticing spaces. Again, if you were to do a kind of collective oral history of all these people in their late 20s, early 30s and say, how did you learn all the different kinds of skills? It would be this dog's breakfast, literally, of different ways. Not coordinated, not coherent. Everybody finding their own way, and some of them, against the odds. And I'm amazed that people end up like Bo and others, becoming, and especially I think, if you're a young woman looking for those kind of opportunities versus a young man, that makes a difference. So there's some gendered obstacles in the way of a lot of our industry. And so to me, as a scholar, those are some of the things that interest me. Even as I'm eating, I'm kind of wondering who made this food, who's in the back, and how did he or she even get to the point where he or she could be making food this good?
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead, Bo. Go ahead.
Alexandra mentioned about the culinary arts school include some walk program, but I think the main point is that there's nobody willing to co-op their job in a Chinese restaurant setting, right? They want to go to a fine dining, they want to go to a hotel, they don't want to working in a Chinese restaurant after they graduate. That's the problem. I think to solving that problem is we need you guys to more promoting the Chinese food, to making them working proudly for themselves. Right? I think that's the way to attract them into a Chinese restaurant.
Well, the Chinese Restaurant Awards, I know Ray Kung, who manages it, has always tried very hard to, not just promote Chinese food, but to involve students. At any dinner she has, she brings in students to work, to learn, work alongside the master chefs, to participate in the award ceremonies. I think, but there has to be, she can't be the only one. Yeah.
Well, we are getting near our final time here, and we could go on for hours. I guess I would just like to ask you each if you had any final thoughts or that you would like to impart. And if that's too big a subject, if you were going into lockdown for 6 months, what meal would you like to eat?
Well, the first thing I had is, and when I came out of lockdown, when restaurants reopened again, was some dim sum, because that's something I'm not going to cook at home.
Right, yeah, yeah, I can understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and since that was on the top of my list, but you know, it's actually interesting. I already mentioned, you know, Lin Cafe. That was one where, because, you know, of the uniqueness of someone who is well trained in French culinary techniques, but also really brought it to, you know, some of those Vietnamese, you know, cuisine that he grew up with himself and as part of his community. You know, that was a very unique, and that was something that both my wife and I sort of said, okay, we got a chance for the first time in 2 years to go out as a couple, you know, just the two of us, and where are we going to go? And that was the one we chose. But it's really resonant with a lot of what we talked about today, which is it's really about that uniqueness that is the person who made it, you know, and you can see it and you can taste it. It's in that meal. And I think that to me is a treasure, you know, that it's really rare, actually, if you think about how many meals you have where, you know, I associate that more with it going over at a dinner party and being invited by someone you care about, and it's a friend, and then the food is them, and there's part of that love and nurturing and hospitality that this, of course, this is made by this person, and the person and the food are all become one, and that's, you know, when you can get that in a restaurant, then, you know, you'll pay anything in my mind to get that.
Me, it's a reverse way. I work in the kitchen every day. So if you ask me what kind of food I want after that 6 months lockdown, probably not. I want to see my customer come in, sit down, and I enjoy the moment I cook the food for them. Just calm myself down and just you know, cook the best meal I can. That's the best way that I can enjoy, I think.
Well, that says a lot, and that's, you know, you want that nurturing. You want people to have that experience, and it, you know, it comes from the heart, and it's the kind of experience that, you know, Henry was talking about as well. Well, we are at the end of our session here today. I can't thank you all enough. I've been so excited to be part of this. The history, the stories, the experiences, you know, and all of it has made me very hungry. And when I go and have a really good meal, I'm going to think about many of the things that you said today. Thank you so much. And I'm in a windowless room right now, but I'm assuming the sun might still be out. So thank you for taking, you know, an hour in the middle of a sunny day to share, and have a good day, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.